Great. Okay, perfect. So it's great to see you all here. So for the next 6 or 7 Wednesdays, not including the third Wednesdays of the month, I'm going to be having the Wednesday night classes. So yeah, y'all are going to be stuck with me, but that's okay. What did I want? How did I want to start this? So I'd actually spoke with BC a while back that I'd wanted to do this series. This series I got actually from a brother. His name is Cliff Goodwin. It was a series that I got from his lessons at Polishing the Pulpit. Heard them there. They really inspired me, how he was able to talk about the text that we're going to be going through, and how it applies much to our lives and such. So it's a major source of where I got a lot of my inspiration on how I was going to do this study. If y'all can, please turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 16. That's where we're going to focus the bulk of our time on. I'm going to do a little bit of a pretext, giving a bit of the context before this chapter, and we're technically going to start in verse 33 of chapter 15. So just 2 verses right before that chapter. But if y'all can, go ahead and turn to 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 33. But just before I get started on this chapter and talking about it, I do want to give a bit of that context. So, as we all know, the first official king of Israel was Saul. Saul wasn't a good king. He didn't follow the Lord. He died, and from there David was a new dynasty and replaced him. David, we all know, was a good king, arguably one of the best kings of Israel. Was very faithful to the Lord, not perfect, but very faithful. And then he had his son Solomon, who started off as a very strong king. However, with time, due to the influences that he had in his life, particularly his many wives, he started to stray away from God, and as a result, his actions led to the dividing of the kingdom. The northern kingdom was taken over by Jeroboam. He ruled the 10 tribes in the north. If y'all don't know all those names, that's okay. I struggle to remember them too. But at the very least, the southern kingdom was ruled by the son of Solomon. His son was Rehoboam, and he ruled Judah and Benjamin. Yeah, that's what it was. So then the kingdom was divided, and that's where you read all about that earlier on in First Kings. It's not echoing for y'all, is it? No? Okay, sorry. It's just weird hearing the voice behind me, because I'm used to hearing it from there, so I don't hear the echo. I just got to get used to that. I'm sorry. Where were we at? Yeah, so Jeroboam, both kings were very flawed, Jeroboam especially. And if you read earlier on in 1 Kings, I believe it's in chapter 14, it talks about how because Jeroboam was given control, was given responsibility of the northern kingdoms, but he chose not to follow God. Even though a prophet came to him and told him, you are going to be given this power, you're going to be given this authority, and yet Jeroboam, instead of choosing to follow God, he chose to reject him. He chose to do his own thing, and as a result, his family was cursed, which at the end of chapter 15, a bit earlier before we start, it talks about how the dynasty of Jeroboam was wiped off the face of the earth there too. So now we're going to go ahead and, with all that context in mind, we're going to go ahead and start off in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 33, as it reads. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, began to reign all over Israel at Tirzah, and he reigned 24 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the ways of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. Verse 1 of chapter 16. And the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hananiah, against Baasha, saying, Since I exalted you out of the dust and made you leader over my people of Israel, and you have walked in the ways of Jeroboam and have made my people Israel to sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I will utterly sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Anyone belonging to Baasha who dies in the city, the dog shall eat, and any one of his who dies in the fields, the birds of the heavens shall eat. So this part already tells us, there's a new king of Israel, and while he did get to reign for 22 years, or 24 years, my mistake, he was a very flawed king. He was a very evil king, and as a result, the same curse that fell on Jeroboam was the same curse that fell on Baasha, because he chose not to follow the Lord. In reading this chapter and going through it, we're going to see that the kingdom of Israel goes through a lot of turmoil, a lot of dynasties being toppled over, new kings being put in place. It's a very unstable time it's a very unstable time during this period of the northern kingdom, during this period of Israel. So we see here that Jehu, who was a prophet, prophesies the fall of Baasha and his family. As it continues, verse 5, "Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did and his might, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son reigned in his place. Moreover, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha and his house, both because of all the evils that he did in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the works of his hands, in being like the house of Jeroboam, and also because he destroyed it." So here, here it's once again just emphasizing that point that Jehu prophesies the fall of Baasha's house because of his sin, because of his flaws, because he chose to follow in the ways of Jeroboam, and that's actually going to be something that we see more often here. Continuing on in verse 8, so this is Elah, which is the son of Baasha, and we saw how Baasha reigned for 24 years, a good period of time. And yet here we see that Elah reigns for a lot shorter, as it reads. "In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah the son of Baasha began to reign over Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned 2 years. But his servant Zimri, a commander of half of his chariots, conspired against him. When he was at Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of who was over the household of Tirzah, Zimri came in and struck him down and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place." So here we see, Elah only reigned for 2 years. We don't know much about him, but what we do see here is he was already inherently flawed. I remember specifically in Brothers Cliff's lessons, when I heard them, he specifically mentioned how, the only thing we know about him is that during times of conflict, Elam, my mistake. Sorry, these names, they interchange a lot, but there's still a lot to learn from these people. Elah, he chose, instead of to be on the front lines, leading his people, he decided to stay in his palace. He decided to get drunk. He decided to not rule with authority, rule with wisdom. He instead decided to, live in what would be the term? Live in debauchery. He decided to live a life of pleasures. He didn't care for being responsible. After all, he was the king, he was the leader, and as a result, one of his servants, Zimri, was able to conspire against him, was able to use his influence and overthrow him. And as the passage soon reads that we're going to read here, the prophecy that was placed on Baasha, his father, soon came to fall upon him. So as it reads, when he began to reign, as soon as he had seated himself on the throne, he struck down all the house of Baasha. This was Zimri, overthrowing Elah. He did not leave a single male of his relatives or his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the house of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and all the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned, and which they made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles and the kings of Israel? So here we read, that once again, that as was prophesied, not only was Baasha, he died, not only was his son killed, but, his entire family, his lineage was wiped out. That dynasty came to an end. There would be no future, no successors, and Zimri would end up reigning in his place. However, as we're going to read right now, Zimri, once again, just like the two previous rulers, was just as flawed, was just as evil. So if y'all want to go ahead and continue with me, we're going to be in verse 15. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days in Tirzah. Now the troops were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, and the troops who were encamped heard it, said, Zimri has conspired, and he has killed the king. Therefore all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. So Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah. And when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the king's house, and burned the king's house over him with fire, and died, because of his sins he had committed, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the ways of Jeroboam, for his sin which he committed, making Israel to sin. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri's and the conspiracy that he made, Are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Israel? So here, Zimri is he's officially written as a king of Israel, and yet we see he only reigned for 7 days, only for 1 week. We understand that that's such a short period of time. So once again, we're seeing that these men who are not faithful to God, these men who are only trying to rule God's people, for their own personal gain, not because they want to glorify God. We see that God allows their sin to punish them, that because they decided to overthrow these people, for their own personal reasons, someone else came behind them and stabbed them in the back. In the case of Zimri, we see that, another person who wanted to overthrow him, Omri, was the one who did that. And Omri's the character that we're going to go into. So once again, we see another king who was unfaithful to God, who chose to do evil. He only lasted 1 week. Imagine if he chose to be faithful. Imagine if he chose, if not only did he do the work of God, but chose do the work of God by wiping out the house of Baasha. If he also decided to follow God and to be a good king, imagine what could have happened for the kingdom of Israel. Imagine how long he could have reigned, how his children could have reigned. He could have been the next David for the northern kingdom, but instead Zimri just decided to do his own thing, just pursue his own desires and not the desires of God. Right now, continuing on to verse 21. Then the people of Israel were divided into 2 parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri overcame the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died, and Omri became king. So here we see, after that short week reign of Zimri, there was a civil war that occurred for about 5-6 years in Israel. Half of the Israelites in the northern kingdom supported Omri. The other half supported this other guy named Tibni. However, Tibni, after those 5-6 years, he failed, he died, and Omri was able to he became the king of Israel and took control, as it reads once again. Verse 20, as we continue, verse 23. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and he fortified the hill and called the name of the city that he built Samaria, after the name Sherner, the owner of the hill. So here we already see some big historical happenings. One of the big things being, that King Omri was the one who founded the city of Samaria. Samaria, becomes a major city in future events in the Bible, namely in the New Testament during the times of Jesus, how he met the Samaritan lady, during the times of Acts when they went to go preach in Samaria and stuff. We see the founding of that city occurred here during this king. However, continuing to read, we also see that Omri was not a good king, just like the rest of them. Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did more evil than all who were before him. For he walked in the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in the sins that he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri that he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the books of chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his place. So right now we'll continue on to him. One thing that I remember hearing is that Brother Cliff Goodwin, when he was giving this study, was that a lot of secular historians, in going through the history of Israel during this time, a lot of them actually view King Omri with favor. The reason why is because they think, there was that time of instability that I talked about, and he was able to stabilize the northern kingdom of Israel. So you'll hear a lot of secular historians talk about Omri in a positive way. He founded this new city, brought stability to the region, and all of that. However, we see the Bible here talks of Omri as a very evil king. Yes, he did get to reign for 12 years, a decent period of time. However, he also continued to bring evil into Israel, and as a result, God informs us, of just how flawed Omri was. The secular world will tell us that he was a good king, but when we look to the Bible, we see just how flawed he actually was. And then finally, the last point in this chapter is going to be the story of Ahab. Later on in this series, I do want to, going through the other chapters, Ahab's going to become a major character that we'll talk about, a major character that we'll study about, but here we're just going to talk about the beginning with him. So as it reads in verse 29, in the 28th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all of those who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than to all the kings of Israel who were before him. Verse 34, in his days Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his younger son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. So finally here, we get to the final king, which the book of 1 Kings, continues to talk about in the following chapters, which hopefully we'll be able to look into in the future. But here we see that Ahab, he succeeded his father and did more evil than his father, which was already saying something. We see how constantly every single one of these kings continued to do more and more evil. And Ahab was the worst of them at this point. He took for his wife Jezebel. Jezebel we tend to know as a very evil queen. Later on in the Bible, it talks about just how evil she truly was, to the point where nowadays, if you hear someone naming their child Jezebel, there's a negative connotation to it, almost as if though someone decided to name their kid Adolf or something. There's a very negative connotation to that name just because of how evil this one person was thousands of years ago. We also see how Ahab, brought all these idols, brought idolatry into the kingdom of Israel. And finally, I gave a lesson on this on verse 34 a couple months ago, how the kingdom of Israel, how so much had changed, the culture had changed so much across this period of instability with all of these evil kings, that that the land that was cursed, the land of Jericho, someone tried to build on it once again, and as a result, his family was cursed, and he lost at least 2 of his sons in reconstructing the city of Jericho. I'll get more to that right now in a minute. But over this chapter, there are a few gleanings that I want us to get, a few. There's a lot that we can learn from it. The first point is, as you all have heard me mention time and time again, evil kings will be punished. Evil leaders will be punished. There's always, if you choose to do your own thing, if you choose to not follow God, you're going to receive a punishment in sorts. We first saw beforehand with the king Jeroboam how he chose to do his own thing instead of following God, and his family was wiped out by Baasha. And Baasha decided to do his own thing and be evil. And what happened? His family was wiped out by Zimri. Zimri only got to be king for a week, and then he was wiped out because all of those people who succeeded each other chose to do evil. They chose not to follow God. Likewise, or in contrast, look at the story of Saul and David. Saul was an evil king. He was a flawed king. And David was a good man, someone who was destined to be a good king. And in choosing to follow God, he was able to overtake Saul, was able to indirectly defeat him and succeed him. However, because David was a good man, because he chose to follow God, he was blessed, and his family was blessed as a result. Unfortunately, it didn't get... I would argue, in fact, that, if anything, that David was so blessed that one of the reasons why the southern kingdom was more stable than the northern kingdom was because of David's love of the Lord. In the southern kingdom, we do, reading through that, you see how there are a lot of flawed kings. There are many kings who are flawed in that time, but there were also many good kings, kings who walked in a similar path to David, and it all started with him because he chose to follow the Lord. And imagine if any single one of these kings, any single one of these usurpers decided to be a good king, decided to be someone who would follow the Lord. Imagine how the course of Israel could have changed. But instead, they all decided to do their own thing. So that's one point that we get from this chapter. The second point we get from this chapter, starting at the beginning, is the story of Jehu. Jehu is he's a prophet of the Lord. There's only a couple of verses here that mention him, and yet we see that because he chose to follow the Lord, he was given a very difficult task. He was told to go to the king of Israel, the most powerful person in this land, and tell him, your family is destined to die. We don't know what occurred after that. After he placed this curse on the king of Israel, Baasha, he might have been imprisoned. He may have suffered because of this curse that he placed on Baasha. However, he chose to still do the right thing, and God upheld that curse, because he commanded him to do that. And as a result, we see what ends up happening. Baasha might not have even believed it. After all, he got to reign for 22 years, but his son only got to reign for 2 because of the evil that he brought on the land. So that is another major point that we see here. That the work that God has us, that he instructs us to do, we're not always going to get to see it. Jehu prophesies that, and that prophecy didn't occur until 20 years later, until the next king, where Baasha's reign would come to an end. The third major point that I want to mention here, there's 2 of them that are similar. As we were reading this, you might have heard a couple times, in the ways of Jeroboam. We see, Jeroboam, he was a king who had passed away years before this, and yet his evil, became almost a running joke in a way. I guess you could say, because he was an evil king, all the kings that succeeded him were evil. You read throughout this, as I was reading through the chapter, how each of these kings walked in the ways of Jeroboam. That meaning, that they decided to not follow God. They decided to do their own things. No one wants that to occur to their own name. I don't want to hear 100 years from now someone walk in the ways of Alisdair, and that means that they decided to ignore God. They decided to do their own thing. They decided to live in a sinful life. If I were to hear 100 years from now someone walking in the ways of Alisdair, I would hope that would mean a positive thing. I wouldn't want that to mean a negative thing in the same way that it meant in this chapter. In contrast to that, one thing that I had noticed in reading this was how, when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, because 1st and 2nd Kings go through the story of the 2 kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, often the writer, the way he'll introduce the timeline is he'll often say it by saying, in the 2nd year of this king in the south, this king began to rule in the north. Vice versa, in the 10th year of this king in the north, this king in the south began to rule. So the primary purpose of saying that throughout this book was to kind of help understand the timeline. However, one thing that really struck out in my mind was, because in this one chapter alone, we saw how many kings? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kings, that all passed through. And a lot of it was due to violence. A lot of it was due to civil wars and usurpers. However, in every single one of these cases, there was always the same king that was referred to, Asa, the king of Judah. In chapter 33 of verse 15, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah. In chapter 16, verse 8, in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah. In verse 15, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. In chapter 29, it mentions, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. We see how in this whole chapter, it's described how the northern kingdom is going through so much instability, so much evil that's going on. And yet in the southern kingdom, they've had the same king. There's been so much stability that has occurred in that land. And I didn't get to go over it today, but if you read about the story of Asa in chapter 15, verses 9 through 24, we read that Asa was actually a really good king. Not perfect, but actually a really good king. In chapter 15, verse 11, it reads, "And Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done." I know many years ago, I don't know if y'all ever have this. Sometimes there are lessons that like you hear once and they stick with you for years on end. One of those lessons was actually about the king, about Asa. It was specifically given by Trey Roach years ago here at this church. And that lesson always stuck with me about the story of Asa, how he got to reign for 41 years because he chose to be a good king. However, at the end of his reign, he messed up and faltered, and God cut his reign as a result. So here, we read that Asa, for most of his life, was a good king, and while the northern kingdoms dealt with so much instability, so many issues, he chose to be faithful. He chose to follow the Lord, and as a result, Asa and the southern kingdom actually got to have stability. They got to thrive, whereas the northern kingdom, because they chose not to follow God, because they kept having kings who chose to reject God, they kept having instability and civil wars and countless many evil issues. So that was one point that stuck out to me as in studying this and going over this story. And the last point that I want to make mention of is the last verse in this chapter, verse 34. I know most of y'all were here a couple months ago when I gave a lesson on the story of Hiel, so I'm just going to give a brief summary of what I talked about then. We see how, because of all of this instability that occurred in the northern kingdom, we understand there was the curse on Jericho that was talked about in the book of Joshua, how no one was supposed to touch that land lest their family be cursed and their children die. And for most of Israel's history, they understood that curse. They chose to leave the land of Jericho alone because they knew it was cursed, because they knew the evil that would fall on them lest they touch it. However, in this time, due to all this instability, due to all these evil kings that we see, the culture of Israel had changed. They no longer were a holy people. They weren't a godly people. Instead, they were doing their own things. They chose to follow their own desires. And in this story, verse 34 tells us, Hiel, he chose to follow his own desire. He chose to look at the land of Jericho and chose to rebuild the city for his own personal glory. And as a result, this verse tells us, that he lost his two sons, just as it was prophesied back in Joshua, that if any man who were to rebuild that city, that they would lose their children too. So those are the main points that I want us to understand from this text. I know I read through a lot, and there's a lot of names. A lot of names that I went through and such. I highly recommend that you all read this for yourselves, just to understand this, because sometimes for myself, I'll read the Old Testament and I'll just feel like there's just a bunch of names that I struggle to say. Just like right now today, there is a few names that I was struggling to say in here. But yet, even with that, even if it might be easy to look at the Old Testament in that way, just simply thinking that it's just names that I struggle to read about people that lived thousands of years ago. But it's important that we recognize that we can learn a lot from these people, even those who were flawed, as we've read in this chapter. These people who chose not to follow God. We can learn how to not live like them, how to avoid their pitfalls, and how we can be better than that, and how by being better than these sinful people, how we can lead fulfilled lives. We can lead lives that God can bless us with. That is where I'm going to leave this lesson right now. Next week, we'll go ahead and start off in chapter 17. We're going to be talking about Elijah and Ahab and get into their story as it continues. But with that, I conclude my lesson. Were there any comments, any questions that anyone had, any corrections in case I made a mistake? No? Alrighty then. Well, I thank you for your time. Let's go ahead and go to God in a word of